Welcome to another video and another instalment of Revisiting, where I look back on one particular album. And today we're going to look at a real knockout, and it did knock me out when I listened to it last night in preparation for this video. This is Pretzel Logic by Steely Dan, with this wonderful front cover photograph. And let's just show you the complete gatefold. So we've got a nice shot there, and we've got the band on the inside. More of that in a moment. So this picture, I do have some information on it. The album cover photo features a New York pretzel vendor, and it was taken by someone called Rhiannon Rubinstein, a photographer of musicians and Hollywood celebs. She took the photo on the west side of 5th Avenue and 79th Street, just above the 79th Street transverse. That's the road through Central Park, at the park entrance called Miners Gate. So there we go. Now we know. So this came out on ABC Records, and it came out February the 20th, 1974, got to number 37 in the UK, got to number 8 in the US. It was recorded at Village Recorders in LA, produced by Gary Katz, who produced the first couple of Steely Dan records. And it was a bit of a step forward for them, I think. And let's just get into a little bit of that now. So this record, it was the one that really got me into Steely Dan. The first album that I got was Asia, and I liked that one, but I did find it a bit, you know, it's got that kind of jazz cocktail kind of sound. It's a little bit polite, it's a bit smooth and refined. And then I started to pick up their albums on CD after that, and I liked all of them. I was kind of tracing back, but when it came to this one, there was something about this one that really clicked, particularly the track Night by Night, heading into Major Dude Will Tell You and Barrytown. That run of tracks on side one, particularly Any Major Dude Will Tell You, I just remember falling in love with that song one day. Just the wonderful keyboard sound on it, just wonderful kind of organ playing, I guess. And what this record, I think, has in spades is just this great conciseness. In a strange way, and I'm not going to make a direct comparison, the album that it sort of reminds me of, and I think it was the same year actually, was Sheer Heart Attack by Queen, funnily enough. There's a bit of a parallel going on. Queen, on Queen 2, which was their second album, they did all these advanced, you know, long format tracks, and then on Sheer Heart Attack they made everything very snappy and short. And Steely Dan did the same thing, really. Their first album was quite concise songs. The second album, Countdown to Ecstasy, has much longer songs, and it's not proggy, it's not progressive exactly, but it's definitely jazzy, and the tracks are quite protracted, elongated. On this album, everything's very, very snappy, particularly side 2, which really does remind me of side 2 of Sheer Heart Attack, where it just goes into one quite short song after another, you know, quick fire. Also, at the end of side 1 of this record, you've got East St. Louis Toodaloo, which is an old Duke Ellington song, which features the sound of, I think it's Walter Becker, imitating the sound of a muted trombone using one of those sort of guitar talk box things. And that really reminds me of the stuff that Queen were doing in the early 70s on Sheer Heart Attack and Night at the Opera, where they were imitating you know, old-fashioned jazz combos in the studio using guitars and, you know, whatever came to hand. So a kind of playful quality, and also a Beatles element, I think, really comes into this album. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were jazz heads, really, but I think the Beatles were one of the few bands they had any time for, and there are definite moments on this record where you can hear Beatlesy chord progressions and also Beatlesy arrangements too, and we'll get to that as we start to go through the tracks. So just a bit of background to Steely Dan. They were formed in 1967 at Bard College, which is in Annandale-on-Hudson in New York. And Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, the two founder members, along with, I think it was Denny Diaz, the guitarist. In fact, I think Denny Diaz actually advertised for musicians, and Donald and Walter replied to his advert, and then they kind of became their band, really, and Denny became their guitarist. Originally, they moved to Brooklyn and became songwriters for hire, and they started working for this guy called Gary Katz. Gary Katz basically invited them out to California, to LA, signed them to ABC Records, and originally they were just going to be used as staff writers, but then nobody could play their songs. They were too advanced, you know, because they had studied composition. Donald Fagen had studied composition at Bard, and you know, he was very influenced by Duke Ellington, and they were pretty advanced in terms of their chord structures, and most of the musicians that they wrote songs for couldn't really play their stuff, you know, couldn't handle it. So they formed their own band in order to play their own material. Denny was brought in, or stayed on board anyway, to play the guitar for them. Jeff Skunk Baxter came in to play the guitar as well, so they had two guitarists. And then the drummer was Jim Hodder, I think. And this is the lineup that you can see on the gatefold of this record. But as we'll see in a moment, it wasn't quite the truth of the situation. So the first two Steely Dan albums, Can't Buy a Thrill and Countdown to Ecstasy, they were band albums. And they were a touring band by this point, and they were using jazz in a rock setting, but they were still definitely a rock jazz band rather than a jazzy, like a jazz fusiony rock thing, which they became later on, almost jazz pop, I suppose, later on. But when they came into the recording sessions for Pretzel Logic, they decided that they were going to begin that process, which culminated in Asia a few years later, where they were going to turn into a kind of studio band, really. And the guys from the band were rather marginalised, particularly the drummer, Jim Hodder, was just reduced to playing backing vocals on Pretzel Logic. They got in two drummers. They got in the legendary Jim Gordon, who just played with everybody in the 1970s. He was the guy that ended up murdering his mother and going to prison. He was schizophrenic. And they also brought in, I'm assuming, quite a young Jeff Porcaro, who later played with Toto, of course. And he borrowed his shuffle style of drum playing, really, from Bernard Purdie, who then went on to play with Steely Dan later on. So they got these two very, not flash, but very accomplished session drummers in, and their own drummer Jim Hodder was rather sidelined. But then they also brought in a big load of other session musicians as well. They had Michael O'Martian on keyboards, David Paich on keyboards, Ben Benet, guitar, banjo, Plas Johnson, Jerome Richardson and Ernie Watts on sax, Ollie Mitchell on trumpet, Wilson Felder on bass, Chuck Rainey on bass, and then they also had Victor Feldman, the legendary British jazz musician. He was brought in to play the flapamba, which is a sort of wooden vibraphone, and you hear him at the very start of the album, at the beginning of the track, Ricky Don't Lose That Number. He plays this really strange, spectral sounding percussion part on this instrument, this vibraphone. It was chopped off the single version because it was released as a single, and that was kind of lost in the mix, but it's a really intriguing opening to this album. So essentially that's what kind of happened. They were moving into that zone, really, of being studio auteurs, bringing in musicians to help them record. They were still going to do some touring after this record. They toured in the summer of '74, and they might have toured after that as well, but they were gradually going to move away from that. And I think this album is just fantastic. It shows them really flexing their muscles. They still sound like a rock band. They haven't lost their edge. There's a great crisp sound. There's wonderful instrumentation and arrangements. It's a great headphones album. All the different interlocking guitar parts and the keyboard parts, and you know, there's some sort of interesting Beach Boys touches here and there. You've got some sleigh bells at the end of, I think it's on Charlie Freak, which is meant to be set on Christmas Day, I think. There's a kind of Christmassy ambience going on there, but there's all sorts of touches like that, you know, vibraphones and jazzy kind of sounds coming through. Just in the context of these very concise pop songs. Ricky Don't Lose That Number, the opening song, famously borrowed the groove and the feel of Horace Silver's Song for My Father. It's got a bit of a Latin feel to it, but then it goes into this just this really great sort of bluesy pop rock song, really, about an older guy who's just basically, I think the idea of the song is that he's had the beginnings of a romance with this girl called Ricky, but then she decides to bail out on him, and he writes his phone number down on a scrap of paper and gives it to her, and the song is him just addressing her, you know, saying, Ricky, don't lose that number, you know, don't go home and throw it in the bin. You know, he kind of wants to still see her. It's a great example of Donald Fagen's individuality and uniqueness as a lyric writer, and, you know, he sings it brilliantly. Night by Night is just a great track. It sounds like one of those great old 1970s cop shows. You know, you might have heard it on Kojak or Ironside or something like that. It's got the brass arrangement, and You know, it's about I think it's about a low-life criminal, basically, who's just living on his wits. There's some really great lyrics, very impressionistic lyrics. They wrote in broad strokes, really, and allowed the listener to fill in the details. When the Joker tried to tell me I could cut it in this rube town, when he tried to hang that sign on me, I said, take it down. When the Dawn Patrol got to tell you twice, they're going to do it with a shotgun. Yes, I'm cashing in this 10-cent life for another one. They just love writing about sleazy, down and out, criminal types and just, you know, the seedy underbelly of American society. But then Any Major Dude Will Tell You, which was the B-side of Ricky Don't Lose That Number, is one of the most beautiful, sunny songs they ever did. It's just a song of absolute optimism. Any major dude with half a heart surely will tell you, my friend, any minor world that breaks apart falls together again. Wonderful lyrics. And then Barrytown, which is the fourth song, is just a great up-tempo rocker, really. It refers to a town near Bard College in upstate New York, which was a hotspot for the Moonies. That was the followers of the Unification Church, led by the Korean religious leader Sun Myung Moon. Only Steely Dan could write songs about these kind of things. And it's a song about small town prejudice. You know, he sings in it, I can see by what you carry that you come from Barrytown. And it's kind of addressing somebody who comes from this town who's maybe a little bit strange, that kind of small town thing. And I think like Randy Newman, you know, they often wrote from a third person perspective, adopting characters and writing in the third person, just these little sort of mini short stories, really, with a bit of satire coming through. Side 2 starts with Parker's Band, which is just a big rollicking number, really, an ode to Charlie Parker. And then through with Buzz, the second song, which is about 90 seconds long, has a lovely string arrangement. It sounds a bit like Tony Visconti. It's not Visconti, it is Jimmy Haskell. And essentially it's just a song about a guy who's through with Buzz, because Buzz has basically stolen his girlfriend and gone off with his drugs, I think. You know, again, it's just like a little short film. Quite a few songs on this record come across like little short, maybe B-movies or just strange cult films from back in the day. Almost like a sort of pre-runner of something that Quentin Tarantino, you know, was doing much later on, Low Lifes and, you know, these little fragmented stories. And then you've got Pretzel Logic, which is I think it's a 12-bar blues, a slow bluesy song with some great playing, you know, great guitar playing. A song about time travel, apparently. With a Gun is a bit of a fast country and western song with some real great whip crack guitar on it. A song about crime and vengeance. It's almost like a little mini western, really. I understood that you will soon be leaving town. Don't try to call me when they finally run you down. Just give fair warning any time you come around. Sort of moving from genre to genre, you know, from little crime movies into westerns. You know, brilliant. Now, Charlie Freak, I think, is one of the best songs on the album, the second to last track. It's just, it's a very haunting song, a very beautiful song. So it's basically the story of a guy who meets a homeless person in the street and buys a gold ring from him. And then the homeless man then blows the proceeds on getting high on drugs and then ends up dead. Poor kid, he overdid, embraced the spreading haze. And while he sighed, his body died in 15 ways. When I heard, I grabbed a cab to where he lay. Round his arm, the plastic tag read DOA. Yes, Jack, I gave it back. The ring I could not own. So the idea is that he rushes back to the scene where this guy is now dead. And of course, it's too late to give him his ring back. But the music is really beautiful. And that was the great dichotomy always with Steely Dan. Just this wonderful, beautiful music and, you know, gorgeous harmonic progressions. That's what really knocked me out about this album, and with quite a few of the Steely Dan albums when I first got into them. Just these outrageously inventive chord sequences. I've always loved that. I've always loved bands that use chord sequences really cleverly. And Steely Dan, they had it down to a fine science. You know, they had their own. I think Donald Fagen had literally developed his own harmonic concept. You know, he had his own way of playing the piano, and he drew on things like Henry Mancini and Duke Ellington and the old jazz guys, and it was not really something that was happening in much else pop and rock music. Maybe Joni Mitchell might have been the only person in the 70s because of the sort of musicians that she was using, but it was quite a rare thing to find, really. And then the final track, Monkey in Your Soul, has just got a great groove. It's quite a nasty song, quite a dark angry song, really. I've got 1 and you want 4. It's so hard to help you. I can't keep up with you no more. You treat me like it's a sin, but you can't lock me in. You want me here with your right to the end. No thank you, my friend. I fear the monkey in your soul. So yeah, altogether I think just a really great album. Again, I listened to it last night and it did knock me out. It's one of those albums that every time I hear it, it just it floors me, just with the amount of invention that goes on in there, the lyrics, the music, the performances, everything about it. And they haven't, at this point, they haven't, as I said before, they haven't gravitated yet towards that very smooth sheen which they were going to get later. They were still recognisably a rock band, and this album I think did really well for them. It was certainly a bigger success than the previous album, Countdown to Ecstasy, which had been a bit of a flop I think commercially, and it set them on the road then for the next couple of albums. You know, you had Katie Lied after this and The Royal Scam, yeah, there were plenty more great albums to come. Anyway, I thought I would do a video on that album, Steely Dan, Pretzel Logic. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of it, and I'll see you in the next video.